So recording now. So I'm going to go over the basics of creating our player character in this demo, and then talk a little bit about setting up the project and some basic stuff with Godot. Sorry? It may already be on there. You can search for it. If you hit Command Space, you'll bring up the spotlight, and you can type in Godot, and if it shows up, then it's there, but it probably isn't, so you probably will need to download it. But for the demo part, you don't have to follow along. You can, watch and then do it later. It's already there. Okay. Okay, so with Godot, when I first open it up, I'm going to see this thing that says you don't have any projects. Would you like to explore the official example projects? That might be fun to do at some point. I'm not going to do that now. I'm going to start with my own project, so I'm just going to hit cancel here. And so one of the things I'll try to go over now and also talk about throughout the semester is keeping everything organized. So when we're using Godot, we're going to be looking at files that are just like on the computer, and we need to make sure we understand the relationship between the files that we're working with in the game engine and the files that are on the computer. If I go back to my Finder and go to the desktop, remember on Tuesday we created a character design, and I saved this under my originals folder. So this Pascal file is my original character design, and I don't want that to go into my game because it's going to take up space that's not necessary. What I do want is the sprite sheet that I exported. And so we can see that inside this game folder I created a folder called sprites. So I already have this game folder, so I'm going to try to hook that up to Godot. But if you don't have it, you can always just create a new folder inside Godot and then just put your sprites in there. I just have this one image file, so it's very easy to move that around. But if I want to connect an existing folder to Godot, I can do that. I'm going to create a new project. So I'm just going to click the plus new project here. And so the only thing I really have to be careful about is matching the name of the project to this folder. So what I can do is I can click browse and go to the desktop. And so since I'm on a Mac, there's certain permissions that I have to give to Godot for it to work. So it says, do you want access to the desktop? That's fine. I'm going to go to MMP 270, and then I'm just going to click on my game and click select this folder. So notice that it puts the name that I created here, and it says choosing an empty folder is highly recommended. I already know that I have the sprites in there that I want to use, so I'm going to ignore this warning. If you're starting with a new folder, you can always just move your art in there later. There's a couple options for the renderer. We're not going to, so the forward plus is for like a desktop 3D graphic type stuff. We're going to use mobile. This is kind of the fastest and most sort of like generic style. Even though it says mobile, it works for all the different platforms. So it says supports desktop and mobile, less advanced 3D graphics. We're not using 3D, so that's fine, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to use version control, so you can ignore this, but you can just also leave it. And so once we've got all that set up, we just click create and edit. And it's warning me again, I'm creating a project in a non-empty folder. I'm doing that on purpose, so I'm just going to hit OK. And so it's going to get set up, and this is what it looks like when we first open it. The resolution on what you guys are seeing is very low because of the projector resolution. So you're going to see a lot more space. You're going to have a lot more space to see stuff, but the basic idea is the same. So you can see my sprites folder is down here, and inside there we can see my character sprite. So it imported my art into the project already. This is the default layout for Godot. If you look at the editor, there's different like layouts, and there's a default. We can change this. You can move stuff around. I generally don't really do that. I'm pretty used to their default layout, so I'm not going to move stuff around. But you can, just like Photoshop or other software, you can drag and drop these windows and put them wherever you want. But I kind of like the default. It's good enough for me, so I'm going to leave it alone. The file system kind of shows you what you have on your computer. And this RES stands for resource. So all the resources are in this folder. If I click open in file manager, it's going to take me to the folder on my desktop. So if I'm adding files, I can do it here, or I can drag them directly into the Godot file system. Other than that, the main window is where I'm going to do most of the editing. That's this big middle window. And this changes depending on the context for if I'm creating a scene or writing a script or creating an animation. This window will kind of change in various ways as I'm creating my project. This top left window over here is where I create my scenes and like organize all of the stuff, the components in the scenes. And that's what I'll often call this like the scene window or the scene hierarchy. So if you hear me say scene window or scene hierarchy, I'm talking about this window over here. The one over here, the inspector, shows us properties about all the components. And so we'll use that a lot in a bit. There's a few other things that we'll go over as we go through it, but we can just get started building stuff. I do like to keep things very, very organized when I'm working, so I'll always create folders for all the different stuff that I'm going to be creating in my game, and I'll categorize things based on the role that they have on the game. None of the things that I'm going to do are like absolute rules that you have to do all the time. They're just my sort of preferred conventions, but they're based on the organization of the game and to some extent what I've experienced in, professional or collaborative contexts. Okay, so let's get started. So what I'm going to create in Godot, one of the things that I like about Godot is that like basically everything is referred to as a scene. And the thing that is kind of challenging when you first start to create a game is understanding the structure of a scene. Because we have, basically what we have is little scenes that make up larger scenes. Building stuff in a game engine is more similar to like doing Lego projects than it is to like making a drawing or a painting. It's about figuring out what components we want to make the scene and then how they fit together. And there's a lot of different things that are, we'll kind of cover the different concepts, different parts that we have to put together. But today we're really just focusing on creating a component and adding art to the component, because that's a process that we're going to do over and over and over again as we add new things into our game. So to get started, I'm going to create a folder. So I'm going to click on my main resource folder and create a new folder. I'm going to call this scenes. And in my scenes folder, I'm going to create another new folder. So I really like organization. So I'm always going to be thinking about, having lots of folders that are for specific things. So the thing that I'm going to create today is a component. So my components are items that go into lots of different scenes. So if we have like level 1, level 2, level 3, levels are sort of like a big scene with lots of different stuff in them. Components are the individual parts that go into that scene. Things like the player, the enemies, obstacles, life pickups, items, all those different things are components. They're single things that will have multiple copies that are in all the different levels in the game. Okay, so we have our components. I actually meant to put an S at the end of this. So I'm going to put that, and I'm going to save. And you'll see that this is actually changing what's on our computer. So you can see I added the scenes folder, and there's a components folder here. So even though we're using the Godot file system interface, it's actually just changing the files on the computer itself. Okay, so now I'm going to get started with my first component. And the first component that we're going to make is actually kind of a complicated component. It's our player. That's what we made the art for. And so it's going to be a good way to look at the way a few different things work. And so when I create a new scene, by default, I haven't created anything yet here, and it says create root node. Nodes are kind of like are like building blocks. There are individual Legos. And the way we create a scene or a component is by putting nodes together. And the relationship between the nodes is kind of important, and we'll talk about that, but I'm just going to start building. So I'm going to create a 2D scene, but my player is a very specific type of node because it interacts with lots of things in the scene. And so I'm going to click this button that says Other Node. So I'm going to click Other Node. And then this is going to bring up my node tree where you can see all the different kinds of things you can create in our game engine. So there's lots of different stuff in here, and we'll kind of go over them as we go. But what we want is a character node. So instead of like clicking through all of these different lists, since I know what I want, I can just start to type it into the search bar. I want a character node. So when I type in character, it just shows me the nodes that have that text in the name of the node. So there's only 2 nodes that have a character. There's character body 2D, character body 3D. We're working in 2D right now, so I'm going to go with 2D, and I'm going to click create. And so this is the main node for our scene. Everything else that's part of this component will be part of this main node. And so I have a node now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename it. So it's not a generic character, it's the player. So I'm going to type in player here. And then you can see right here in the editor window, it says unsaved. So I'm just going to hit Command S and save this inside of my scene. So that brings up this save dialog. I'll go to scenes, components, and then it's going to kind of like try to guess what you want to call it. It doesn't really matter that much what you call it. I like to match things, so I like it to be very clear. So I'm just going to capitalize player and then click save. And that creates a .tscn file. This is sort of the basic Godot file type. It's like a PSD or something like that. And most of the things that we create in Godot are going to be TSCN files. Okay, so we've got our player. There's a little warning thing here that says this node has no shape, so it can't collide or interact with other objects. So it is a physics thing. So we do need to like give it a shape, but we also need to give it an animation. So we're going to start with the animation first so that we can see what it looks like and how much space it takes up. And then we'll add some other stuff on top of it. So real quick, when I'm working with this interface, this is the big reason why I want a external mouse, because each button does something different, and the scroll wheel also helps here. So the left button just lets me select things, move stuff around, transform things, rotate things. The right button gives me a context where I can add different stuff. And then the scroll wheel lets me zoom in and out. But then also when I hold the scroll wheel down, that gives me this hand where I can pan up and down, left and right. You can change all those defaults. If you go to editor and go to editor settings, you can change all the defaults. But I'm going to leave them as is for now. And then there's tools up here which we'll cover as we go through, but the main one is just the selection tool. And that tool will change depending on what I'm mousing over at various points. So there's like things to move, rotate, scale. There's other stuff in here that we'll go over as we need to. This player art is pretty small, so I'm going to zoom in a fair amount like this, and then I'm going to start creating my animation. So on Tuesday, we created an animated sprite with a bunch of frames for 3 different animations, our idle, our walk, and our jump. We're going to build those now. So I'm going to click on the player, and when I want to create a generic node, I can either hit the plus button here, or I can, if I'm trying to like move fast, I can hit Command A on the keyboard. And then what I'm looking for now is an animated sprite. So I can type that in, animated sprite 2D. I'm going to hit enter. And we don't really need to rename this. You can rename it if you want, but since it's inside of the player, it's not going to conflict with any other animations. So an animated sprite is just our basic way of doing simple 2D animations. It also has a little warning. So these little warnings show up when you haven't added the components that you need for something to work. So I'm going to click on this, and notice when I click on the nodes, the information in the inspector on the right hand side changes. So this menu gives me different options to edit different nodes. And so when I click on them, it's going to change over here. So I'm going to click on the animated sprite, and what I want to do is create an animation. So I'm going to open this animation section. So it has these different sections with different properties just to keep things organized. And to create an animation, I need something called sprite frames. And I don't have any sprite frames yet. So when I click on this little empty, the only real option I have is new sprite frames. I can create the new sprite frames and save it inside the scene. And if I want to use them somewhere else, I can save them and then load them. But I'm not really going to probably want to do that. So I'm just going to click new sprite frames. And now the tricky part with Godot is a lot of times I've created these new sprite frames and I'm like, okay, where is it? But what I have to do is click on the sprite frames, and that brings up my sprite frame editor. So if I leave here or click somewhere else by accident, what I need to do to get it back is click on animated sprite, and then sometimes you won't see that. You just click back on the sprite frames. So with Godot, there's a lot of windows that kind of appear out of nowhere, and you just kind of have to get used to knowing where you're supposed to click. Okay, so now we've got our animation editor over here. It looks a little goofy because my resolution is really small, but if I drag this over, this is probably closer to what it's going to look like on your screen. So I'll just adjust this a little bit. And so we need to make a bunch of animations, and we're going to go over that process now. So in the animation editor, we have a list of animations here, and then this is our window to actually animate and edit our animations. So with our animations, if I double click on the name, I can change the name. And so our default animation is going to be idle. I don't know why it left, but here we go. And with our idle animation, I'm going to click this button that says autoplay on load. So that becomes sort of the default animation. When the game starts, my player will start on the idle animation. I'm going to use this plus button to add a couple more animations. So I'm going to have a walk animation, and I'm going to have a jump animation. And we'll add to these later on. So we'll start with the idle animation. There's a bunch of settings here. I'm going to leave most of these at the default. So I want it to loop. That's fine. That's what this toggle is. 5 frames per second is fine. If I want it to go faster or slower, I can change that number. This is the playback. I don't have any frames, so this won't do anything yet. And here is where I can actually add the art to the animation. So you can use the folder to add a frame, but what I usually do is use this little waffle thing to add a sprite sheet. Okay, so if we have a sprite sheet, we're going to click on that. If you have individual frames, then you would use the other one. Okay, so I am going to open up a sprite sheet. So I'm going to double click on sprites, and here's my character sprite sheet. I'm going to click open. This brings up a new window where I choose the frames I want for my idle animation. So there's a couple of things that we have to change here to make this look right. If we zoom in on this a little bit, you can see that the lines don't really line up correctly because Godot doesn't actually know how many frames are in this. So we have to tell it. So how many horizontal frames are there? You can see there's 1, 2, 3 frames. So we just change this number to 3. And there's 1, 2, 3 vertical frames. So now it matches the sprite sheet. And now I just choose the frames for my idle animation. So 1, 2, 3, 4. These other frames are for my walking and my jumping, so I don't need those. So once I choose the frames I want, if I click on it again, so if I choose a frame accidentally, I just click on it again and it goes away. Add 4 frames. Let's zoom out a little bit. So that doesn't actually change the art, it just changes the preview in the editor. And now I'm going to hit the play button, and so we can see what this idle animation looks like. I can zoom in a little bit if I want. When I zoom in, it starts to look blurry, but that's just because we're zoomed in here. It won't look like that when we run the game. So this looks fine for my idle animation. If I want to make it longer or do some changes, I can use this to copy and paste frames. So I could like copy and paste this at the end. Oh, it keeps changing the zoom level. It's a little annoying. So I can add an extra frame to the end. Maybe that'll look a little natural. Maybe it looks kind of weird. And if I want to get rid of it, I just hit the delete button over there. So I can use these frames as many times as I want to, to make different versions of the animation. So like, for example, I think I did something where if I drag this one over here, then it'll be like the tail and the blink are not synced. So I could kind of play around with that. But that's the basic idea. I can move the frames around, I can copy and paste the frames, and I can get the animation that I want. And of course, I can also change the duration of a single frame. I'm not going to do this very much, but I could click on this frame and say I want it to play for like 5 frames. Then it's going to stick there for a second. Again, I'm probably going to mostly use the defaults, but if you had something where that was something you wanted to do, you can change the individual duration of one of these frames. Okay, so let's set up my other 2 animations. So I'm just going to repeat that process real quick. This is something we're going to be doing a lot because every component that we're going to add needs a visual animation to go along with it. So now I just click on jump, the frames go away because I'm editing a different animation. So I need to add the frames again. So I'll click on the waffle again. And I'm going to choose the same art. And I'm going to need to readjust my horizontal and vertical again. And now I'm just going to choose, which one am I doing? The jump. So the jump is my last 3 frames. I'm going to add those 3. And then this one, I don't want to loop. This is just going to play once. So then we can see what the jump looks like. And it doesn't loop. So we see when I hit jump, we'll just see those frames. If it matches the actual jump, great. If not, you know, I'll fix it later. But for now, that's good enough. So I'll save that. And let's go to walk. This one we do want to loop, of course. And so now I just select the same art with the waffle button, choose the same horizontal and vertical, and now I have my 2 walking frames. And let's play that to see what it looks like. And that's pretty good. So I've got my walk animation. Okay, so I'm gonna save this. I think I'm all good here. I'm gonna click on the idle, just that'll be what it shows in the preview. So that looks good so far. So now I just have a couple other components to add. So I'm gonna get rid of the sprite frames window. You'll see some of the window options down here. If I click on those, it'll toggle it on and off. So if I want to get rid of a window, I can do that. Okay, now my player needs what's called the collision shape. Collision shape is the thing that tells the game engine if my player is running into stuff, like the wall or the floor or other items in the scene. And the collision shape should match the art, but it's not the same thing as the art. This is a very important concept in game design, is that our collisions are done, our collisions have to match the art, but they're not the same. So what we see and the space that the components actually take up are separated. And there's a lot of reasons for that, both in terms of visual, how the game looks, but also in terms of performance of how well the game runs. If we were checking to see if all the art was overlapping with other art, that would take a lot of work on the processor side. The shapes that we use for collisions are much simpler. So I'm going to click on the main player node to make sure that this is part of the player. I don't want it to be part of the animation. So I'm going to click on the player. I'm going to click the plus again, and then I'm going to type in collision. And so I have a couple options here. A collision polygon is a more complicated shape. I don't really need that. I want to stick with simple. So I'm going to choose a collision shape 2D and click create. This comes with a little warning because I have to choose a shape. So I'm going to make this window smaller. And so when I choose the collision shape, I can see the properties over here in the inspector. And so I just have to choose a shape. So I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to use a capsule shape. This is a little bit more complicated shape, but it's more similar to what my character actually looks like. So I'm going to click on that. And so now we have this blue collision shape that represents where the collision occurs. You can actually change that color. That's the debug color here. So if your character is blue, you might want to choose like, you know, something like that. So it's very easy to see the difference. My character isn't blue, but it's pretty close. And then another thing that we have that we're going to use with a lot of our objects as we're designing stuff is the transform. The transform is the position, scale, and rotation of an object in our scene. It's sort of like in Photoshop when you do free transform, you can like rotate and do different stuff. And so you can tell our collider doesn't really match the cat because the cat is longer than it is tall. And so I can just go down here to rotation and rotate it by 90 degrees. So I'll just type that in and hit enter. And there we go. So now I can change the collider to match the shape of the cat. But one thing you'll notice is I don't want the collider to be larger than the cat. If the collider is larger than the cat, then the cat will run into a wall, but the art there'll be a gap between the art. So it depends on the style. If you want a little bit of an overlap with the other things, then you want the collider to be smaller than the art. If you want it to be like very flush, then you want to match the bottom of the collider as much as you can to the feet of the character. I like a little bit of overlap, so I'm gonna do like this. And you can see as I'm making these adjustments, you can see the properties changing over here. So you can always just click on these little reset things and that'll reset to the origin. So if you get like over here and you can't find it, just hit the reset and it'll bring it back to 0, 0. So I'm gonna move that back here. I can reset the rotation as well. All of the properties have these little reset buttons if we wanna undo them. I'm recording and it'll be on the YouTube playlist. Okay, so we've got our collision shape. I'm trying to think if we have to add anything else. I think that's it. We're gonna add probably a sounds later, but for now I think I'm gonna ignore that. We're probably gonna add other stuff at some point, but for now, we're gonna look at how do we put this into a scene, and then we'll pretty much be done for today. Okay, so we have our player. Oh, actually, one more thing that we need to do is add our script to our player. So earlier we downloaded the scripts from the link on OpenLab. So I'm gonna go back to the Finder and open up a new window. And when you download it, you should have like a little zip file like this. And if you double click that, it should take it out and you'll see all the scripts in here. And we just need to put this inside of our main game folder. So I'm gonna rename this folder scripts, and then I'm just gonna drag this here. So now we have scenes, scripts, and sprites. So we can add these scripts to our components. So when I'm gonna select the main player node, and I'm gonna click on the empty here and click load, and go into scripts, and there's a script called player controller. You can also turn on the list view. That might make it easier to find stuff. So the player controller is what we use to control the player, and there's a bunch of different options here, like if you want the player to slide, if you want friction, if you're using gravity, how much the player can jump, if you want to double jump, wall jump, the player can throw projectiles, and then the Y limit, for how low the player can go in this scene. There's a bunch of different settings here that we're gonna not really deal with for right now. We'll deal with those next week. But I'm gonna save this, and now we're gonna put this component into a level. So I'm gonna leave this here, and I'm gonna go to scenes, and I'm gonna create a new folder, and I'm gonna call this levels. And inside levels, I'm gonna create my level 1. So I'm gonna add a new scene here, and I'm gonna choose a 2D scene. So this is just a generic 2D scene. And I'm gonna call this main node level 1. I'm gonna save. And so I'm gonna go back for a second and go into scenes, go into levels, and it turned this into like level _1. That's fine, it doesn't really matter what this is, but I'm just gonna match what I have up here. So I'm gonna call this level 1. And so the way that we start to build our scenes and our levels is by adding our components into another scene. So this is a really important aspect of how we work with Godot, and most game engines have some version of this. So when I want to add one scene into another, I use this little link button. This is called the instance or instantiate, and it basically means we're adding a copy of one of our components inside of this scene. So I'm going to click on this link button. And right now I don't have that much, so it's very easy to find the player, but if I had a lot of components, I would just type in player. And I'm gonna hit player here and click open. And so now we see our player inside of our scene. There's not a whole lot going on in this scene, but we can preview the scene and see what we've got so far. So to preview, I'm gonna use this little button up here that kind of looks like a movie clapper. That's the preview button. This play button is like the build button, which is gonna like build the whole project. They're pretty much the same thing, but right now I just wanna test the scene, so I'm gonna click on this here. And we don't see anything because we don't have a camera. So that's the next thing that we have to add. So we want our camera in this instance to follow our player. That isn't always the case, so sometimes you have your camera separate from your player. But if we want our camera to follow our player, an easy way to do that is to add in a camera. So we're going to add a camera 2D, but it's going to be a child of the player node. So when I hit enter, see how the camera is connected to the player, and if I collapse the player by hitting this little arrow, the camera disappears. This means the camera's inside of the player, meaning if I move the player, the camera's gonna follow. Okay, so there's a couple settings that we'll look at with that in a second, but for now, we're just gonna leave that there. You can put the camera like on the main level like this, and so now when we play the scene, you do see the player. But if we move the player, the camera is not going to move with the player. So actually, let's set up the player movement real quick. I do want to wrap this up soon, but then we'll look at the difference there because that's important. So to move the player, we have to set up a couple things. If we click on this script, you'll see what a script looks like. And we'll go over this more. But you can see all the different variables that, or the properties that are related here. But one of the things is the scripts will have some instructions about what you need to do. And so it says the player controller uses the following inputs: move up, move down, move right, move left. And these are inputs that we need to define within our game so that it'll recognize what buttons we want to attach to those different properties or those different actions. So to do that, we have to go to our project and go to project settings. There's a bunch of other stuff in here that we'll go over eventually, but the main thing that we're going to look at right now is the input map. This maps buttons on the computer, the keyboard or the mouse or gamepad or other things, to actions in our game. And so we don't have any right now. We're going to create some, and we have to make them match what the player controller is looking for. So for example, if I want my player to move right, I need to use the move right action. So I'm going to add this, and so now I can map move right, and I can change this just by clicking on it and editing it. So if you have a typo, you can change that. I'm going to hit the plus button, and I'm going to just hit the key that I want to go along with move right. So I'll just hit the right arrow on the keyboard, and it's going to see that. So I'm going to hit OK. And I can actually add multiple ones. If I also want the D for WASD, I can do that. Okay, so I'm going to keep going with the rest of my movement. So I'm going to add move left. That could be the left arrow. Oops. Oh, you can't hit enter on this because it'll change it to the enter key. You have to hit the key and then click OK. I can use the A key. And this can be whatever keys you want. You don't have to use whatever I use. Okay, we have move up. So I'm going to add that. I'll add the others. Move down and jump. There's others, but we'll worry about them later. Okay, so for move up, I'll have the up key, and I'll have the W key. For move down, I'll have the S key and the down key. And for jump, I'll use the space bar or the X key. Okay. So I can use multiple keys. Of course, you don't have to add. You can add the ones that you want to use. So I'm going to save that. And so now, hopefully this will run. We might run into some errors, but I should be able to move the player. And there you go. So now I can move the player around the screen. Okay, so that's really exciting. I can hit Command period to stop my preview. And I can hit Command R to run the preview. Okay, so we've got our cat moving around. Pretty cool. So if I want my camera to follow the cat, I can parent the camera to the player. So I just drag the camera onto the player. So now this isn't going to look like anything because the camera is following the player. And there's nothing else in our scene, so it just looks like our player is staying in one place. But I have some options on the camera. I can make it sort of like follow the cat. If I turn on position smoothing, and then I have to set, I think those are already set, so let's see. Yeah, so you can see that it's kind of like bouncing a little bit. So I can make the camera kind of follow the cat. I have some different options there. You guys can play around with that. I won't go over all of those. So that's basically everything I want to cover so far. There's obviously a lot more to cover, but I think this is enough for us to get started. The main thing is really just like building the animation and then putting the player into the scene. If you can't get the player to move around, I'm not too worried about that yet, but you can try that if you want to. And I'm just gonna really quickly go over submitting the assignment. So I can't really demo this because I'm recording on the screen, so I don't know if it'll let me screenshot. I guess I'll try. So one thing that you can do is just screenshot your game once you have it set up. Let me see if I can screenshot because I'm already recording. If I hit Command Shift and 4, it'll give me this like little thing where I can drag to screenshot on the Mac. And if I hit a space, it's gonna turn it into a camera. And if I just click, oh, it does work. So I can make a little screenshot. And so that'll go probably on my desktop. And so I'm gonna make a new folder for screenshots, and I'll just drag this in here, and I'll just call this player intro. Okay, so now I have a little screenshot of the player in the game. Just to kind of show our progress as we're building our dev blog. So for this assignment, all I need to post is the sprite sheet of the player, which is inside the game sprites folder, and then a screenshot of the player in the game. So I'm gonna do that real quick. I'm gonna go back to Chrome and go to the blog and make a new post. And I'm gonna call this Godot player intro. And normally I'd want to write some stuff. I'm gonna try to just skip over that real quick. Here's my first Godot scene with my player. And then I'm just gonna add a couple images. So I'm gonna click the plus, go to image, upload, go to my desktop, go to my game, and go to sprites and choose my character sprite. And if I want to center this, that might look nice. And then I can put my sprite sheet here. And then I'm gonna add my screenshot. So I'm gonna do another image. This screenshot obviously isn't very exciting, but we just wanna get in the habit of posting examples of our work as we build out our game. We want to be able to show people what we're working on to get, to have some documentation, to get people excited for the design, get feedback. There's not a lot going on here, but it's just getting that process started. So here we go. My character in a Godot scene. Okay, so that's all we have to do for this assignment. Let's preview real quick. And there we go, that looks good. We're gonna publish. Oh, and I forgot to add a category. I'll do that next. So I'm gonna copy this first, and then let's go to categories. I'm gonna add a new category, Godot intro. And so now to submit the assignment, I just go over to Blackboard, go to assignments, go to character design and animation. That's what I should have called the category, but whatever. Create submission and just paste this link in there. And that's all I have to do on Blackboard. All right, I'm gonna stop here